Welcome back to Heightscast, the podcast of the Heights School. This is Rich Moss with you from the campus of the Heights in Potomac, Maryland. We're here to talk about the education and the formation of young men fully alive in the liberal arts tradition. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for sharing us with your friends. Thank you for just being a part of the extended Heights community. Very, very grateful for your membership therein. I am delighted today to welcome a colleague, Mr. Jimmy Callahan. Welcome, Jimmy, to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
And before we get to this conversation, which I'm really excited to have and soon to share, just a couple of announcements as per the usual about upcoming events here at the Heights through the forum and just the life of the school for our parents. The first is that on February the 1st, Mr. Joe Cardenas will offer a lecture on beauty in churches. So it should be a great lecture with a lot of beautiful just imagery and slides and all the rest of it. So look forward to that. Also, the Fathers Series for Heights Fathers will begin this February the 6th, and we'll have 3 separate nights for a lower school gathering, middle school, and upper school. And each of these gatherings will discuss different aspects of how fathers are called to share God's plan for marriage and human love with their sons. So really important nights for us as a community, especially for us as a community of fathers. Really encourage you, Heights dads, to join us, if at all possible, for whichever evening corresponds to your son's school division. Finally, we also have the Parents Conference coming up in April, so stay tuned to the website for more information about that. The topic will be freedom and addiction. So obviously, we want to punch through the obstacle to reach the end. The obstacle to that end is the just all the different forces out there striving to addict our sons or to lead to addiction, and really freedom is the end for which our boys are created. And finally, we'll have just kind of mark your calendars very generally for the Teaching Men's Conference. This will take place in October of 2025. So you can just sort of loosely look forward to that, especially our teaching friends beyond the walls. All right, so all of that aside, check more on the website. It's a lot of good stuff there. But now we get to the main event with my friend Jimmy. Jimmy, you're a Heights graduate, class of 2006. Started working here in 2013. And most of your work probably is with our alumni, the head of alumni relations. So Jimmy is the person to call if you're interested in finding a Heights man for your team, your staff. So you've just done a great job of fostering I think a community of alums. It's been a really beautiful thing to witness. In addition, though, you studied history at the Citadel, and so you share that knowledge with our own students. You teach AP U.S. history in the upper school, and you are also I think you worked on a congressional campaign before coming here to teach. So you've read the books, you've talked the talk, you've walked the walk. And I think over and above all of that, of course, husband and father, most important accolade. But also you are just an avid reader. I'm just like always jealous of the number of books that you're reading and how quickly you're able to get through them and retain the stuff. So this is going to draw on that experience. We're going to talk about Orestes Brownson, right? Not Brownson. Brownson. Okay, good. Orestes Brownson. This is a thinker who, as a Notre Dame grad, I would see his name, but I never actually read, because he's of course buried on campus in South Bend. But I don't think I read him during my time there. And I always kind of had him filed away as somebody I wanted to come back to. But you've brought him to our school. You've brought him to my consciousness, and for that I'm grateful. And as I dive into this thinker, I'm asking myself, why in the world have I not read him until now, right? And so I think that for me is just would be a great goal for this podcast, is to just get especially teachers of government or of U.S. history or really whatever else, educators, because Brownson has a lot to say about that, to take a look at this really great thinker. So let's begin with just kind of bottom line up front. You know, if we're in an elevator together, Jimmy, and I'm like, hey, what are you reading? And you say, well, Orestes Brownson. And I say, wait, why in the world should I read Orestes Brownson? Why should we be interested in this guy?
So I think first of all, because he's an American original. I think that's the best way to understand him. He is a guy who was born in the early republic in New England, kind of the hotbed of intellectual, religious thought for the United States and intellectual thought, and he genuinely sought truth in this early republic. It's kind of a, every man for himself world. His father died when he was very young, and he just decides he's gonna find his own truth. And his journey, spiritually, politically, intellectually, I think is unique and fascinating, and it really helps tell the American story of the 19th century. And he'll, I kind of, not coincidentally, I think, die in 1876, which is the centennial and the sort of first big celebration of the founding 100 years after. And his thought, very unique. It's not surprising that he's sort of lost in American history, because he kind of angered and upset all the right people, you could say, sort of both sides of the political spectrum, the religious spectrum. People didn't like what he had to say because I think it hit really close to home. And he was troubling to a lot of people. He was a contemporary of John Henry Newman, who many of us are familiar with, the Oxford movement in England. And he actually had some, intellectual disagreements, and then eventually a reconciliation with John Henry Newman, which is kind of a full circle moment where a lot of these people are coming together. And many of the listeners probably have read John Henry Newman, who is very influential with people like Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton, Ronald Knox, and many others, but they've probably never heard of the American version. Who I was listening to one guy, and he said he's probably the greatest American Catholic apologist besides Fulton Sheen. Or, Fulton Sheen kind of finally exceeded him. Yeah. And he had the advantage of radio and television and all these things, versus Orestes is sort of lost in the dustbin of history.
Yeah. And partly, pardon me, but partly because I think of his Catholicism, right? And it's not just Catholics who look on him as this great apologist. It's also non-Catholic, even pretty non-sectarian thinkers and leaders. I mean, we're talking Woodrow Wilson, Arthur Schlesinger, who have looked at him as a truly great. Schlesinger wrote a biography about him, and I think in it, and I didn't read the biography, so all of this is coming from very much a non-expert looking for reasons why I should immerse myself more in this thinker. But I believe that Schlesinger wrote this biography about him, in which he says that he was maybe the greatest thinker of the 1800s America. Yeah. So I mean, it's pretty profound. And one of the reasons why I think he's sort of been lost is because at the time that he was writing, he was a Catholic, and undoubtedly that was a strike against you when he's writing. And I've heard non-Catholics make that comment. So great to bring him back into the forefront of our pedagogical consciousness here. As I'm reading him, I can't help but think also of Bishop Varden, who we had on a podcast a few episodes ago, and he actually wrote a book about remembrance and the importance of just remembering and reminding ourselves of where we've come from, who we are, and what our history is, where we've come from, rooted in kind of the great exhortation of the people of Israel. Hey, remember Israel, where you came from. And I think Orestes Brownson, I almost think of him as this great reminder. He's encouraging us to remember where we've come from. And so as we're talking about all these things in class that we're just sort of like throwing up on the board, and we're having the kids memorize them, remember sovereignty and consent and all these other things. And Brownson just does such a beautiful job of reminding us of where all that stuff has come from, and not only where it comes from, but how we as Christians, even as Catholic Christians, should take these different concepts, whether it's federalism or consent of the governed or sovereignty, et cetera, how we should receive all these things from the framers and really improve upon them, not by rejecting them, but by bringing our relationship with our Creator into these founding concepts. It's a remarkable, really beautiful just work. Can you tell us a bit about his biography? You hinted at it a little bit, but it is truly fascinating. Who was Orestes the man?
So he was born 1803 in Vermont, which, some of us know a little bit about Vermont. I've been there maybe once or twice, but it's this very sort of unique place. It's a little different. It's more of kind of it's not Boston, but it still has that New England flavor and, very rich sort of independence and the Green Mountain Boys and Ethan Allen and which I always remember. You distinctly remember these things before you even know what they are. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured Fort Ticonderoga in 1775 and then took the guns for the siege of Boston, and you're like, and then you learn about those things, and you're like, wow, that's incredible.
This. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this story, know it, probably tell it, but for any teachers of lower school history, this is just history gold. The story of Ethan Allen marching into Fort Ticonderoga and that
middle
encounter.
of the night.
Can you tell
and
us
they just
real
walk
quick?
in,
Sorry, total
and I think
tangent.
they literally just walked in, and the guy was
Surprise
in his
the
nightshirt.
redcoats.
Yeah, and we're taking this fort for the whatever he would have said, because it was before the Declaration of Independence, probably the colonies or something, But it's an incredible story. And then what is it? Henry Knox taking the guns from Ticonderoga to Boston, just incredible. So he would have grown up. Orestes grew up in that world, in the wake of those things, that in the shadow of the founders and the giants of American history. But his father died when he was very young, so he was actually raised by this elderly couple who basically left him to his own devices. And he did things like he read the Bible, he educated himself mostly, and he began to sort of explore different religions. His family was Presbyterian, so they believed in sort of predestination, Calvinist, and he sort of embraced that partially, but then he also he didn't really like that idea of predestination, so he kind of went the other way with universalism, which was another sect in New England at the time, where everyone will be saved. And then eventually he got into Unitarianism, which is sort of like the descendant of deism, where they don't believe in the Trinity, and they've sort of moved on from difficult doctrinal questions of Christianity. That was very popular in New England at the time. And he embraces these, and he sort of grapples with them, becomes a minister in both of those churches, and then eventually finds them both sort of wanting. He becomes basically an atheist, embraces radical politics, labor agitation, and even called and sort of predicted a violent labor uprising in the United States because of the working conditions in the early factories in New England and things like that. And kind of the first moment he jumps onto the radar more broadly in the United States is the election of 1840. He wrote a essay called On the Working Classes, and it was meant to help the re-election of Martin Van Buren in 1840. But the Whigs took that essay and used it as, hey, look, these people are very radical. He's a socialist, which was sort of just a new idea at the time, very radical, very attacking sort of the status quo, the establishment, particularly in New England where you had all these factories and things. So that was used as sort of a millstone to hurt Martin Van Buren and help William Henry Harrison, who only serves very briefly, but help him win that election in 1840. And Brownson then becomes very disaffected with politics, and he sort of steps away, and he starts to grapple with his religious ideas, his political ideas, and eventually comes to the idea that there has to be some sort of higher authority guiding your beliefs and guiding even a state, a nation, and eventually adopts, Roman Catholicism as, he says, there is no way to know truth, or there is some authority which will help man find that truth. And if it doesn't already exist, it's never going to exist. And he eventually comes into contact with the church and, as they say, crosses the Tiber, which is a really big deal in New England, where that is not popular. It's very anti-Catholic. And it's also during the time when the Irish immigrants were starting to come over, and Catholicism was viewed as the religion of sort of poor Irish immigrants, and people who were very different from the status quo in the United States at that time. So very controversial, but it's a seriously bold step that he takes to embrace Catholicism in the 1844.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is a guy. I think he's an interesting person for, I think, our students to ponder, because he seems like just a devoted truth seeker.
Yeah.
And he doesn't just kind of conveniently dip his toe into the water. He takes premises and he chases them to wherever they lead. He says, wherever this goes, I'm going there. And so just to see, beginning Calvinist, Presbyterian, Universalist, Unitarian, Socialist, Atheist, it's just an interesting thing. Now, as he's going through this path, of course, fast forward, and this is probably his great work, right? The American
Definitely,
Republic. Wrote this after the Civil War.
Yep. I think he received some. There were people who really liked his writings. He mostly published in what was called Brownson's Quarterly, which people actually read those things a lot more than they do now. He was very prolific, but a lot of his writing would be what we would consider kind of articles or pamphlets, things. So there's a lot of that stuff out there.
Yeah.
But most people who have read him read The American Republic, which is his sort of magnum opus about the Constitution and the American founding.
Yeah, and I guess he wrote this book. I mean, brief parenthetical. I printed off one of his pieces from the Quarterly, and I mean, this is 1, 2, 3,
exactly. It's
4,
pretty heavy.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I mean, it's a long piece, very small font. So this is a guy who thought deeply and wrote a lot. This book in particular, he wrote after the Civil War. It seems like he's trying to figure out what exactly the American project is.
Absolutely.
What is the American Republic, right? Because we have this idea of consent. And wait, I thought we were told that we could withdraw our consent to the government at any time. But if not, then what are we? A devoted patriot, which is interesting, right? Because Catholic
Absolutely.
and devoted patriot, to the point where 2 of his sons died
Exactly.
in the Civil War, which is like, you just have to take a step back for a second and ponder that. Like, how would you respond to the death of 2 of your sons?
And that's kind of what he did. He actually stepped back physically from his work, as you can imagine. Imagine 2 of your sons dying in this grave conflict. So it wasn't just sort of save the Union, free the slaves, and it was very personal, hit home to him. His sons died, and so he does step back. But then after that, he gets a bunch of his supporters and friends funded his work so he could write the American Republic. And so the willpower to sit down and do that in the wake of that tragedy, both national tragedy and very personal tragedy for his family, is pretty impressive.
It's remarkable. So I mean, this is basically, it's like, why did my sons die? What are we
Exactly.
What are we doing here? Where does this come from? And he starts. I love how he begins the work just with. He basically says, there are these different theories of consent. What is consent? And so then fast forward to my classroom. I mean, we are so encouraged in this country. To like we have our creed as Americans. There is a creed, and it's like we came from Locke and we came from Hobbes, and that's that.
And Rousseau and you see that I recently, I don't know how I never saw this before, uncovered Rousseau talks about this idea of the general will, which I think fits in really well with a lot of our politicians, because they say, well, we know what the people want,
right?
Even if they don't vote that way, we deep down we know. So just let us do it. And I think you see that with times like the progressive era.
Yeah,
that's sort of their creed. Well, just vote for us, and we'll do what's best for you, even if it's not what you actually want us to do. But we know what's best. We're the experts,
right.
And those are the people that, if you read the American Republic, you'll see 40, 50 years before that, Brownson is not only predicting those people, but warning against those type of people.
Yeah,
so he's very concerned
really
about
is.
that.
No, you're right. Like, reading this, he's basically saying, heads up, this is what's coming. And so, part of me says like, he was right, look at what's happening. But on the other side, he proposes very beautifully. I find a strange kind of like optimism in his work. And because he is confident in the American project.
Absolutely.
Right. And so he says, he's not just saying, hey, be attentive to this, but he's also saying this is the way forward. And these are the ideas that you can bring into this amazing thing that's happened, right? This American Constitution, which we'll talk about in a second. But here's what you can bring into that to make it the fullness of what God wills for this country. It's very beautiful. So I think we at this point we'll shift sort of from the man who, I mean, he might have had a role in the Emancipation Proclamation, encouraging Lincoln to issue that earlier than he might have otherwise. I mean, just a lot of stuff. And I'm not a historian or an expert, and I think just this is a person for people to read and to read about. At this point, I'd love to touch on some of the ideas that he brings to us, and so one of those ideas would be, and we're sort of hinting at it here, the idea of democracy. And so, can you just introduce us to what he wrote about democracy, the different types of democracy, and where he sort of encourages us to settle as American patriots?
He has two big ideas. And if you read this American Republic, and I had the privilege, I got to give my guy a shout out. I had the privilege a couple years ago to work with one of our now graduates, Seamus Regan, who goes to Williams College up in Massachusetts, plays lacrosse there, and he did the Jackson Scholars, and we were going back and forth about different topics. And I said, what about Orestes Brownson? And he was like, who is that?
Yeah, exactly.
But good on this guy. He battled it, and it was one of the most difficult topics, because I've worked with 4 or 5 guys over the years, because it was a complete unknown for most people. And Seamus really got after it and worked hard at this topic. And the two things we sort of zeroed in on, the two ideas, are the concept of the unwritten Constitution, which we can touch on in a minute, and then the idea of territorial democracy. And for Orestes Brownson, the idea that you were physically grounded in a place was critical to being a citizen of that country. And I think you could have similar ideas if you read, Cicero and things like that, that's beyond my realm, but I think people who read those, the idea of being a Roman citizen or a citizen of the polis in Greece, you have to physically be there. You can't be like, well, I live in North Africa, but I'm part of Athens, I live in this other. No, you have to physically be there to be a part of it, and you have to be a stakeholder. You have to own land. You have to be a part. You have to really be that's why they had to take up arms and things like that in those cities, but. So it's not just about agriculture, or he's not some dreamer Jeffersonian. Oh, you have to have a farm to be a real citizen. He's not saying that, but he's saying just by virtue of we live in Virginia, we don't live in Maryland, you and I. So it's like we have no power here. Basically, our power is based on our political influence. Our citizenship is based on the fact that we live in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And even more specifically that, the county that we live in, the local area we live in. And that's this idea of territorial democracy. It's grounded, it's tied to that physical presence, which I think would frustrate people who now you might call globalists or sort of internationalists, or people who always seek to take power and move it to somewhere else. But I think it would fit in very nicely with, say, the Catholic idea of subsidiarity. Kind of keeping things in the local, that's the best way to deal with them, which, if you read J.R.R. Tolkien and Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, all these guys, they really love that idea of let's keep it where it needs to be. The Shire doesn't need all these other outside authorities. It's they govern themselves, and they govern themselves well because they understand themselves best. So that's kind of this idea of territory, but if the state isn't also part of the bigger nation, it also has no authority. And there is a place for the national government, the state government, the local government. Each of them has their defined place. And when they move out of that, that's when you get problems. And that's where people in his time were willing to use the state as a hammer to sort of beat down the other. You saw the business owners in the Northeast pushing for tariffs that made the South frustrated. But you also saw the South using the federal government to protect the right to slavery, and using that as a hammer as they expanded across the what is now the southeastern United States, the western United States. They wanted to gobble up more territory for slavery. So it's both sides were sort of using the federal government as a hammer to beat down the other. And he didn't like that. He didn't like the sort of radical individualism of the South. Hey, I can do whatever I want. This is my property. I can have whatever I want. He didn't like that. But he also didn't like the sort of interventionist attitudes he called the humanitarians of the North, particularly the Northeast, also using the government as a weapon to sort of beat down their enemies. He didn't think that was right.
Yeah. And I want to go there next. Humanitarian democracy and personal democracy as the kind of the two alternatives on either side of this concept of territorial democracy. I do think it's important to take a minute and just ponder, like, okay, yeah, he's a transcendentalist, or he was.
He was a transcendentalist.
He was,
yeah,
and so he does have this kind of like romantic side to him, but Absolutely. It seems like he's moved past it in a way, and so he's maybe left some of that Jeffersonian idea of like we all just need to go be on a farm, and anytime we want to rebel, we just go ahead and do that.
Exactly.
But then he's almost like, you know, a proto Wendell Berry type in a way, and I know people will have a lot of things to say about, you know, contrasting them and all the rest of it, but something about him reminded me of Wendell Berry, like this idea that, listen, you are from a place, and there's something about land and being rooted in a community, and when you leave that land, when you leave that place, you've lost something, you know.
Exactly.
And sometimes you have to, you know, you got to go, you got to take care of your family, but there is a certain importance to land, and it's not just the land itself, but it's sort of like the land, the place where you're from, your family, your community. That's where a lot of your rights and your duties are defined, discovered, lived, and then you kind of have this relationship of places where it's like Mary McGiffin did just a brilliant job of kind of looking through a lot of his writing and shared some thoughts, but the idea that he wasn't a fan, obviously, of the United States as a confederacy, sort of like, you know, where states could kind of join not join, but he saw it more as a family. Where it's like, no, you are born into even places are born into places, you know?
Exactly.
So it's kind of I don't know, it's sort of like, you know, he was 100 years ahead of some of the folks right now who are encouraging us to think and act local. I mean, maybe he started that trend. Although Cicero did, you know, back in the day.
100%.
So not just Wendell Berry.
I think that's why he's so interesting. Like, that's why you should read Wendell Berry. That's why you should read Willa Cather, because these people, they grapple with the American experience. Yeah. And even if you don't agree with them, that's okay. You should think about their thought, because history is simplified so much. History is dehumanized.
Yes.
And you think it's just a bunch of memorizing. So most people go, oh, I don't like America. I don't like history. It's boring. It's too many dates, You need to memorize dates. I'm a big believer in that. But you also have to understand the human experience. That's why literature, and we have great, you know, Mike Ortiz and company. I remember Dr. Matt Meehan was my English, like, bring it, you need that so you can see the personal human experience, but you also need to understand humanity. And then you start to realize, wait, the politicians of the 1840s and 50s are not that different from the politicians of now.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And
it's amazing.
He was grappling with it. He's giving an honest take in the American Republic on what was happening. People want to simplify everything about the Civil War, everything about that era. They want to simplify it. Oh yeah, you just know this one thing and you're good. But he actually grapples with the ideas of the Southerners, of the Northerners. And he largely saw these two sort of factions, you know, the sort of humanitarian, and you would lump in a lot of those New England intellectuals to that category. And then in the South, what we call the fire eaters, or the people like John C. Calhoun, and the kind of more, you know, radicals on both sides. He was sort of, no, this is bad, but this is also bad. Mm-hmm. And you need that connection to the land and the territory. And you can't just secede whenever you want. Like, that was a big debate at the time. And Lincoln, you know, if you read Lincoln, he's got some great stuff there. Others, but it wasn't just Lincoln. You know, Stephen Douglas, who was Lincoln's political opponent, was a huge advocate for union. Andrew Jackson was a major advocate.
It must be preserved.
For union. Yeah, and that's how him and John C. Calhoun had a falling out.
Yeah.
Over the idea of union. And some of those, they're a little overzealous, but it's like, hey, this is, and Brownson, I think, does a really good job of explaining, like you said, this is bigger. But also we need to maintain the limits, because a lot of those sort of humanitarian types, the New Englanders, they saw themselves as these self-righteous, if you've ever heard the battle hymn of the Republic, it's like, oh, we're coming for you, like terrible swift sword and all that, But not every person in the South was a fire eater who needed the terrible swift sword.
Right.
Yeah. So it's like,
nation building.
Let's tame that down a little bit. And I think Brownson does that, which is back to my original point, how he kind of angers both sides. Neither one can sort of love him, because he's not just saying, oh, it's okay, buddy, you're doing the right thing, and he's bad. He's saying, no, that's wrong, but that's also wrong.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the position you often see the church in. Like, I remember as a kid, Pope John Paul II being like, wait a second, what the United States is doing, going into these wars and things like that, that's not good. And I remember being like, well, what do you mean? Like, we're patriotic and we support these wars and things like that. But it's like, hey, sometimes the church is a sign of contradiction, like what Simeon said at the presentation. You will be a sign of contradiction.
Yeah. And
it's you have to pause and sort of remember, sometimes there's a higher calling, there's a higher truth than just whatever some government official says.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Brownson can help us sort of remember, pause, ponder a little more before we speak.
Yeah.
And we just embrace whatever the current political trend is.
Yeah. No, that's totally right. Didn't come to bring peace, but a sword.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
And Orestes seems to have cut in multiple directions, which is great. I feel like, okay, we've got this buffet set of. I mean, we're talking about consent, talking about sovereignty, federalism. He discusses patriotism, education. There's like this buffet of incredible topics in front of us, and let's just kind of like sample and hopefully just make people hungry, Yeah. But you already alluded to humanitarian democracy and personal democracy, and it seems that he was sort of dissatisfied with democracy generally, and perhaps just because of part of his own religious experience, he had this sense that we need something more than just the will of the people. But can you just give us a snapshot of humanitarian democracy, personal democracy, and why he had issues with both?
So, with the individual, what he called the personal democracy, and that's the difficult thing, I think, with when you read political philosophy, is people use different words.
Yeah.
Like, we can talk about it more in a second, but a guy that a lot of people have probably read is Edmund Burke. Him and Orestes Brownson had a lot of the same ideas, and they were both big on you need some sort of guiding star for morals and truth, and kind of Burke uses the term prejudices, which is a very negative term now in general, but what he meant by that was you need the knowledge that people have from their experience, what your grandfather taught you, what your father taught you, what your religion teaches you. You need to apply that knowledge to your decision-making for government, and otherwise you're going to get astray, as you can see we've gotten in our country, because we don't often have that. And so he was arguing for that, and that was that having those sort of fixed ideals that don't change, the permanent things, as Russell Kirk called them. That stands in contradiction to both of these ideas, the individual and the humanitarian, because the individual wants, I want what I have, I want whatever I want now. And how can you, it's the sort of egalitarian, a lot of the French thinkers like Rousseau and others, Locke, well, I am this individual, Hobbes, I'm this individual and I should be able to do what I want. And maybe I'll give up a little bit of my power, my authority for safety purposes, but at the end of the day, I'm an individual, so you can't tell me what to do. And in the case of the Southern slaveholders, you can't tell me what to do with my property, meaning the human beings that they enslaved. And they were blind to that blinded them to the horrible human outrage that they were committing of owning other human beings. But so that's where he was questionable of that. But even if you didn't own slaves, it was still this sort of, I can do whatever I want. We see that a little bit now with kind of like libertarianism, or kind of strong kind of there, and it's not necessarily guided by any principle other than here,
right?
Which is what a lot of the sort of transcendentalists and the emotional, the romantics of the 19th century, they were sort of moving into that direction. in rejection of rationalism and the Enlightenment and all that. But then on the other side, the humanitarian is like, well, I know what's best, and I'm a reformer. I'm trying to perfect society, and I know how to do it. So I'm going to use the government to perfect society. And the first sort of aims of that was the abolitionist movement. We're going to get rid of slavery, and most people would say that's a good thing. Very few would say it's not. What some people might question is, well, now you've created this tool of using the government to take and go after ideas that you don't like. A great example is the temperance movement, which Brownson, if you read his book, he predicts that, and movements like that. Egalitarianism, the women's rights movement, and men and women aren't different, they're the same. He sort of predicts that a lot of these ideas in the next century will come up. And, again, the temperance movement is a great example of, no, the solution is we need to not have any alcohol, and then everything will be fine because these people drink too much. So we're going to prevent them from drinking.
Yeah. And
you see with that, the prohibition movement and all that they actually achieve that end. And so he sort of predicts things like in that vein, where this using the government to achieve your goals of reform, and the idea that human society can be perfected by doing things like banning alcohol.
Yeah.
Obviously not the case.
Right. No, totally. It's interesting because you see some of the same tensions going on right now, and maybe even the use of one tendency towards democracy or one democratic manifestation that he talks about almost employing an appeal to a different type to achieve its ends, sort of like a humanitarian democracy under the guise of personal democracy, driving something forward. So it's really interesting. But then he just cuts right through the middle, and he says, I love this quote: "The American Republic has been instituted by Providence to realize the freedom of each person with advantage to the other." Right? So like we being fully ourselves will allow all of us to flourish together in community. And it's like the end of this government thing is not the government. The end here is to help us enter into a deeper relationship with our land and with the community, and with the God who gave us this land. So it's just the personal democracy of the individual at the expense of all these broader things, versus a humanitarian, which sort of just sees humans as like this abstraction.
And he talks about that. He says they lose the idea of men in the idea of man. Yeah. We're going to help man, but what about Rich Moss,
right,
and his family?
Right,
you're crushing them at the expense, in the name of egalitarianism. And a lot of these ideas are, you see them in the French Revolution.
Yeah.
And then people sort of forget them for a while because they get crushed. And again, Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France, he sort of led that charge in the English-speaking world. No, these are really bad ideas, and we should not do this.
Yeah, totally.
But then as the century drags on, those ideas start to creep back in and become very popular in the United States, particularly in New England. And in England, with the Fabian socialist movement and these sort of gradual policies, you see it with the populists in the late 19th century. Basically, their platform is carbon copy from Karl Marx's writings. And a lot of people don't realize that. And then the progressives, same thing. It's sort of this socialism veiled as democracy. We're going to help people. We're going to reform society. We can perfect society because we are experts. We're going to take a very pragmatic, practical approach to solving the problems of society. And in some cases they do, clean water and things like that. But in other ways, they're really grabbing power and using it at the expense of the people who they claim to be supporting and empowering. They said, we're going to empower the people, but how can you do that when you're expanding the use of government and making the government so much stronger in ways that it never was in the United States? And I think that's where Brownson is very wary of that sort of humanitarian. He wouldn't necessarily oppose to grow, improvement of society. He was he did believe in this sort of idea of progress and we need to keep getting better and things like that, but not in the sort of secular, political, radical sense of, we're going to get better because of the government.
Right.
He was not a believer in that, and he died before the government really sort of went in that direction. But like we've said, he is very sort of prophetic in his writings. But I think that was because he was so deeply involved in these ideas, these bad ideas of the 19th century, which become the governments of the 20th century in Russia, China, all over the world. These bad ideas, and even in Western Europe, in places like France and England.
Yeah.
The ideas of the 19th century that the Transcendentalists, the people who lived at Brook Farm in this communal socialist utopia for a year or two before a collapse, these ideas eventually become the policies of the 20th century, and the body count's pretty high. Yeah. It's a horrific thing, and we see it in all aspects of our society. A lot of these, you read the writings of Emerson and people like that, and you're like, wow, that sounds like what that politician just said.
Right.
And most people don't even realize that, but it's this sort of bad ideas that trickle into American society, and people just sort of embrace them.
Yeah, and that's the gift of education, is that you can confront these things and start to ponder them, and just wrestle with them before you hit the big leagues of adulthood and citizenship. But it's interesting, for some reason, Dostoevsky is coming to mind right now as somebody who is seeing similar time, who's starting to see things happen in Russia, and you read Demons and just kind of like read about these people who love humanity but cannot abide Peter and Paul, and just like the upper crust fascination with kind of cutting edge ideas.
Absolutely.
And you just got to be careful, because those ideas will come back and bite you. And as so many people saw, as Dostoevsky and others warned. But so let's see. The other thing that I would love to touch on just very, very briefly, because he's got a great section in here on consent, and the idea of, Lockean, Hobbesian consent. What is that? And this is, of course, stuff that Americans in government classes and history classes across the United States are memorizing in a day and then just moving on.
Yeah. He's
He's got a great chapter in here on that, which I would like to bring to my own classroom next year. But maybe kind of related, kind of not, is the idea of the unwritten Constitution.
Yes.
And let me just, this can be our closer, because I think we probably have to go teach the young that we're talking so much about. But here's what comes to me. I mean, the idea of the unwritten Constitution as more almost like, it's the context in which it's the mores, the values, the ideas, the land, the rootedness of the people who live in a place, the assumptions, the fundamental assumptions that they make, the gifts that God has given to them through tradition and through history. That's the unwritten Constitution. It makes a nation, and only a nation then can create a written Constitution, which is that which makes the state and the government. It seems to me that Orestes Brownson is one of the best on-ramps that I've come across for students of American history into just the broader tradition of the liberal arts going back millennia, because this is a guy who read Aristotle, Plato,
Absolutely.
Cicero, others. And he's basically saying in 1850, 60, he's basically saying, listen, America is this thing created by providence, but to fully understand the vocation of this, not only this state, but also this nation, you have to enter the broader tradition. So, and he does such a marvelous job of inviting that conversation. It feels in some ways like he wrote this book as an invitation for students to read 100 years later, The Roots of the American Order, where
exactly.
like Russell Kirk takes us into Jerusalem and Athens and all the rest of it. But I think that Orestes Brownson has some pretty important implications for how we should educate, at least the things that we should be teaching. It also strikes me that there's a lot that young guys can relate to in him, right? Is this guy who, I think he feels deeply. He's longing for beauty. He has a sense of introspection, but he's honest. And I think that's one of the beauties of youth, is that you're honest, right? Where you say, you hear a premise and you don't stop short. You say, wait, hold on a second. Wait, why are we not going all the way if you told me X? And he lived that through his whole life. And so I think he has actually something to say to young people who are actually searching honestly for truth. But maybe if you could comment on that, it's kind of my final non-question here, Jimmy, but put some nuance on it, correct me where I'm wrong, and maybe you can touch on this unwritten Constitution of ours, and then what the unwritten Constitution and the protection thereof, as we're trying to protect the written Constitution, what the existence of that unwritten Constitution means for us as teachers here in 21st century DC, you know?
So I think, first off, I think you're 100% right. So many people now listen to podcasts and different things, and they're grappling. And Orestes Brownson is not a sort of Twitter soundbite cable news clip guy. You actually have to sit down with the man and read the book, read the biography, and understand him and think about it. And it's hard. Like I said, I worked with a guy who did a thesis on him, and even by the end of the year, we were still kind of scratching our heads sometimes. And you really have to grapple with it. It'd be great in a classroom environment with an expert, somebody who really knows it, and talking about it, going through it, questioning. But so this idea of the unwritten Constitution, and it's very similar for people who are familiar with the writings of Edmund Burke or they've read Russell Kirk. And by the way, the first way I was exposed to Orestes Brownson was I happened to be reading The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, which is a tome, sort of an intellectual history of the modern kind of conservative ideas. And as Russell Kirk very says, conservatism is not an ideology. It's not an ism in the same way as all these other ideas, socialism, communism, you know. It's sort of a way of life, and it goes back to these ideas of the unwritten Constitution. As Russell Kirk called them, the permanent things, family, tradition, religion, things that don't change. Although some people in our society now seem to think those things can change. But that's exactly why those things are so important. Edmund Burke, same thing. He was born in Ireland, but he was a member of the Parliament, the British Parliament, and he stood up famously for the rights of not only Irish Catholics but also the people of India when they were being abused by the East India Trading Company. And he said, "You can't do that." The Indians, he said, that they're being mistreated. But then he also opposed his own political party over the French Revolution, because people like Charles Fox were saying, "This is great. This is all of our ideals being lived out." And Edmund Burke said, No. They are destroying the ideas that we care about. So there was this big split in sort of the British Whigs at the end of the 19th century. And I think he may have reconciled with Fox eventually. I can't remember, but Fox was sort of his political protege, and they fell out because they disagreed strongly over what was going on in France. And Burke saw very early on what that was, because it was breaking these sort of unwritten constitutional rules. Even there were people in France, I think it's called the Vendée, the French peasants, who sort of rose up against the revolution because they said, no, this is destroying everything that we believe, the faith, the church, the land, the way we've lived for centuries. We oppose the French Revolution. We don't want what you're selling. And I think that's what Brownson is talking about, these ideas. You go back to Plymouth, you go to Jamestown, you go to the origin of the American colonies. These ideas they brought with them from the beginning, and that's where you can't just split it up, because it's bigger than you. It's bigger than, 100 guys sitting in a convention hall in Charleston, South Carolina, voting to secede.
Yeah.
You don't have that power. You're not that guy. And because it's this bigger thing, it's these ideas, this tradition that goes back to the Magna Carta, back to all of Western tradition, the Edict of Milan, all of everything that's ever back to the Romans and the Greeks. Like it's bigger than you. Natural law, truth, and it's accepting that these ideas exist and they're bigger than you, and you can't really change them.
Yeah,
you could try, but it won't work. And those ideas you need those ideas to govern society, govern the way people act. And once you lose that, kind of the democracy starts to unwind into chaos, because what are the guiding principles of that society?
Yeah. And so I mean, gosh, then that just gets me fired. It's not even, I don't know, my class isn't for a few hours, but I'm like fired to get in the classroom, because then, okay, what's the task as a teacher? The task is, I mean, especially for those of us, in kind of the history or government, whatever else, social studies, which we don't refer to as social studies. That's probably a different podcast.
I don't like that word.
Me neither. We'll talk about that later. But those of us who are teaching about the American experience, or I mean, everything's related. It's this beautiful unity of knowledge. But the idea being that, man, if you begin your understanding of what it means to be an American with 1776, and just the idea that you're given in the textbook of a very simple, like, this is me out in a state of nature, and because I can do whatever I want, I choose to consent because that, like, is in my best interest. If that's your starting point, and it is for probably millions of young students, it seems like it just makes you more susceptible to then embrace this personalist, democratic idea that is very easy to manipulate by the humanitarian democratic idea, right? To kind of remake man in whatever image you want.
People sort of make you comfortable, so you're willing to consent to a lot of other things because they're leaving you to, order your food, deliver to your house, play video games, whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah.
You can do whatever. You can watch Netflix all day. Like, oh yeah, this is great. I'm living the good life.
Yeah. Or if you have something, your cause, like maybe you're actually pretty motivated, and you're advocating things, and you're doing all the political things. You're actually very active and industrious. But it's lacking this understanding of the broader picture, which is that, okay, this Constitution bloomed out of a context, and then what is that context that we've been given? And Brownson he also beautifully points out the idea that that this country of ours, it's an act of providence, right? Like Providence brought this thing about. His thoughts, not his words, but Providence brought this country about, and it's basically, as citizens, our patriotic duty is to help this state, which is leading this nation, become the fullness of what it is, as kind of like a reflection of God's goodness. So, man, so much more to be said, but I think we got to stop somewhere.
Yeah, you got to read it.
You got to read it.
You have to remember, you can't lump him in with, like what you just said. He had this vision of the United States had a divinely ordained mission to spread this, but you can't lump that in with the sort of American imperialism of the late 19th century and the sort of, we're going to go out in the nation building. That wasn't
totally violate his territorial democracy idea.
Exactly. Right? A lot of it is our example. Like, you're doing your you're being a good citizen. You're helping the world be a better place. And the American system could be kind of a beacon for that to others. We don't need to go out and conquer a bunch of other countries and say you're going to be like us. That's not it. Yeah. But you can't put him in a box the way everybody wants to say, oh, well, is that person a Democrat or Republican? Is that person are they red or blue? Are they left or right? It's hard to put this guy in a box, but that's what we need. Just like you said, Wendell Berry, G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, all these great thinkers, John Henry Newman. You can't just put them in a box and say they belong to this political party or they belong to this ideology. Yeah. It's bigger than that. Yeah. And they have a lot of things that we need to sit back and think about, get together with some friends, talk about it, have a drink, share ideas like we're doing. It's really fun to have these conversations, and I hope people will take the time and actually, if they're getting to this point, and they're going through it, it's good. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, we'll post in the show notes, a link to actually some friends of the school, the American Family Project hosted a kind of a workshop or a conference on Capitol Hill. I saw that. So we'll post a link to that if you'd like to learn more from some Brownson experts. Absolutely. People who have spent their life studying his work. There's a piece we'll also link to. It's called The Democratic Principle, and this is from his quarterly review. And I think in this he's actually addressing young people as such, kind of talking to them about his own conversion and his own thinking politically and otherwise. But and when you're encountering him, I think it's really interesting, kind of check the date on each piece and see sort of how his thought grows over time. And I think very much towards the end of his life, he became this very good sort of pious man, and he was humbled, you could say. At the beginning, he was very fiery and combative, and then by the end of his life, I think he became very humbled. His sons had died, but his thought sort of over time, 1840s, 1850s, during the Civil War, after his sons die, and then sort of at the very end of his life, he sort of took up the pen again. Just thinking about his thought. The American Republic is 1866, right after the Civil War, but he does continue to write, not as much, but in the last 10 years of his life, and just tracking on that, sort of an interesting idea, how his thought changes over time.
Yeah, no, which takes a certain humility.
Absolutely.
Because he's an honest thinker, I think.
And he actually apologized to Cardinal Newman, John Henry Newman,
really,
for misjudging some of his writings, and John Henry Newman really appreciated that, and that's I think what life is all about. It's like, be merciful to each other, be humble, and it's really hard. You're this giant of American thought to be like, well, actually, that British guy, I was wrong. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And to say that publicly, he probably said it in print, I would imagine, because he in print accused, and I'm sure he publicly apologized. So that's a great. Even if you know nothing else about the guy, like, wow, the ability to say I'm sorry, publicly,
it's amazing.
Yeah,
and I think that's the spirit that he wants us to bring into our government. So, spirit of mercy, of goodness, of belief in he who is ordering all things, and hopefully leading our state, our nation, all of us, our little territorial democracy here at the Heights, onwards to goodness. So we'll have all this good stuff and more in the show notes. But this episode is an invitation to engage a friend we didn't even know we had, and I certainly apologize for any things that I've gotten wrong. We've touched on history, political philosophy, literature, and I know I've gotten probably a couple things wrong because I'm like out of my depth. But
no, and I don't claim to be the authoritative. But it's just like, I think the biggest value here is an intro. Go out and read it, and you might find some things hard or kind of archaic a little bit, or what does that word mean? Why does he say that? But like I said, just really grapple with it the same way you would with other political thought, and see what you can learn.
Just dive in. So that's the invitation. And Jimmy, thank you so much for this episode, definitely, but then also just for bringing him to the consciousness, the greater consciousness. I know a lot of our colleagues were familiar with him and had read him deeply, but I was not among them. So thank you for that. Appreciate you.
We're still working on it.
Working on it. Absolutely. Well, good. Thank you, Jimmy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rich.
So that's it for this week, folks. To support my friend, Mr. Callahan, his work in the classroom, and all of our brother faculty, do consider supporting the Heights financially. To do that, visit heightsforum.org. Click on support. Everything you do is incredibly important. Keeps our doors open here on campus and allows us to spread the mission of the school throughout the United States and the world by means of this podcast and other outreach efforts. Remember to check online for the February 1 Mr. Cardenas lecture here at the Heights for our parents and their friends, to the Father Series beginning February 6th. Very, very important event for our Heights dads here. And then the Parents Conference in April, and of course the Conference for Teaching Men in October of 2025. Feels like a long way away, but it'll be here before you know it.
It's a great thing.
I'm sure. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Live high.